He's the golden boy, of course, has been for almost a century now. The poster boy for ancient Egypt. His death mask was sublimely, breathtakingly crafted over 3,300 years ago. 24 pounds of beaten gold, eyeliner of lapis lazuli, eyes of quartz and obsidian. Probably the most recognizable artifact we have from antiquity.
You know, if you ask a child on the age of 8 and you tell him Egypt, he will tell you King Tut. I made a Skype last week to a school in the States. All the children, they ask about one thing, Tutankhamun.
The sun always mattered hugely to ancient Egyptians, where it rose, where it set. It almost certainly influenced where they built the pyramids and the Great Sphinx, ancient wonders in granite and limestone. Now just over a mile away, modern Egyptians have been building a new home for Tutankhamun and his ancestors, something monumental of their own in glass and concrete. Construction has taken 8 years so far, the opening delayed multiple times, but the Grand Egyptian Museum isn't called grand for nothing. At almost 500,000 square meters, it's the size of a major airport terminal. Most of the huge cost has been met by loans from Japan. The Egyptians badly want the tourists back in numbers. This museum amounts to a calculated gamble, a $1 billion bet on Tutankhamun. When his treasures finally arrive here next year, they'll be the star attraction. This should be their last resting place. A selection of Tutankhamun's treasures have been on the road off and on since the 1960s. The Boy King Asgardian statue, his face and body painted black to symbolize the fertile silt of the Nile. And here, gleaming, wearing one of his many crowns. On the back of a golden throne, a tender marital portrait, king and queen bathed in the golden rays of the sun. And here, on a golden fan, out hunting in his chariot. Tutankhamun's portrait was always idealized, as it was on his death mask. The reality may well have been rather different. Just look at his pitiful mummy as first revealed in 1925. Tutankhamun was probably a child of incest. He was about 5'5", and scientists think that he may well have had a club foot and buck teeth. Dead at 18 or 19, Egyptologists still speculate about what killed him.
When you go really deeply in the collections of the king and the history of the king, you discover that he was really an important king. What is also important about the king is that his life and his death are still mystery. And that's why people all over the world are still fascinated by King Tutankhamun.
This was part of the winning design for the museum, a facade or freestanding wall of semi-translucent stone 1 kilometre long, which could be backlit at night. The architects were a small Dublin-based practice led by an American-Chinese architect, Shi Fu Peng. The Egyptian revolution in 2011 delayed things. Construction only began in earnest the following year. We first caught up with the project 6 years later in 2018. The pyramid entrance had already taken skeletal shape.
It's a new landmark that is being added to the complete view of the city of Greater Cairo. And for the first time, the pyramids and the fantastic treasures of Tutankhamun will be eye to eye.
Driving up to the museum a few months ago, and everything looked pretty much landscaped and ready. But elsewhere, it's still a construction site, and COVID-19 hasn't helped. Going in, everyone had to have their temperature checked, including us. Like extras from a remake of Ghostbusters, the spray gangs were out dispersing disinfectant. The man in charge of the entire site is an engineer and an army general.
رغم فيروس كوفيد 19، لكن احنا شغالين بشكل واعي جدا جدا في تدابير احترازيه ضخمه. النهارده نسبه تنفيذ اكثر من 96.5%. المتبقي من الاعمال هو الاصعب على الاطلاق.
On the ground, we quickly got a sense of how gargantuan this project really is. The statue of Ramses the Great, the largest of all the museum artifacts, arrived in 2018 so they could build the atrium around him. Some 35 feet high, 83 tons of red granite, he's simply magnificent, even with his nose royally chipped and his stubby toes lightly coated in dust. This was a much better place to hang out, much less polluted than where Ramses used to stand, outside Cairo's main railway station. His companions on a grand staircase behind him are mostly still under wraps. There'll be 87 statues of pharaohs and Egyptian gods on the steps. As you ascend, you'll get a sweeping potted history of ancient Egypt, some 5,000 years of it.
المشروع فيه ان شاء الله نهايه هذا العام. هنبتدي بعد كده الجانب الاثري اللي هيتم ان شاء الله في بدايه العام القادم. قد يستغرق من 4 ل 6 شهور. باذن الله يبقى كوفيد 19 سابنا وساب العالم كله، ونقدر بعد كده نحدد موعد افتتاح من خلال القياده السياسيه.
No prizes for noticing the recurring motif. Everywhere pyramids, a mosaic of them, upright and sometimes inverted. Even a resting crane was perfectly aligned with the Great Pyramid. Reassuringly, as on many a building site, there was still a man wandering around with a wooden plank on his shoulder. We never found out quite what he was up to. But what was clear, even from our brief visit, is that this is a museum with a view, and that tourists may need to set aside 2 days to get around it. In the vastness of it all, slowly but surely, they were beginning to tidy things up. An end finally seems in sight. I've been marveling at what the ancient Egyptians left us for some 20 years now, the rough time they think it took Pharaoh Khufu to build himself a tomb, the Great Pyramid. From architectural competition to planned opening next year, the Grand Egyptian Museum has also taken almost 20 years. The museum is manifestly a matter of huge prestige for Egypt. In tandem with the building, an extraordinary program is underway to conserve every single one of Tutankhamun's treasures. The intention is to exhibit them all together for the very first time. The Conservation Center for the Grand Egyptian Museum is said to be the largest of its kind in the Middle East, and a seemingly endless corridor with 10 different laboratories off it, all devoted to the art of conservation. You need intense concentration, a good eye and a steady hand. In the labs, almost a monastic silence. Over 5,000 artifacts to conserve from Tutankhamun alone. His magnificent panoply of death, in the words of Howard Carter, the man who found his tomb. Everything is being freshly conserved so they can show it all for the very first time in the new museum.
I never thought to see young Egyptian genius with golden hands returning every piece back. That was the first thing that captured my heart.
The lion goddess Menhit, with nose and tears of blue glass, eyes of painted crystal. The deity Amut, part hippo, part crocodile, part lion, with teeth and red tongue of ivory. The cow goddess Menhit Weret, a pair of them, solar discs wedged between their horns. Apparently these ritual couches were intended to speed Tutankhamun on his journey to the afterlife. After conservation, they remain in astonishingly good condition. This was a privilege for us to witness, to see all this material before it goes under glass in the new museum. And not everything was golden. Tutankhamun was buried with some 90 pairs of sandals, some of rush and papyrus, others of leather and calfskin. As seen before conservation, this pair had partially rotted away, but they were still somehow saved.
We create a new technique by using some special adhesive. As you saw, its condition, it was very bad, and here I think it's come to life again.
One pair, almost brand new it seemed, was decorated with captured warriors, one Nubian, the other Asiatic. And these sandals Tutankhamun could symbolically crush his enemies underfoot every day.
And what we are doing here is rediscovering the collections of the king again. We are doing a job which is really as important as it was done by Carter.
The Englishman Howard Carter in the centre with the walking stick and his team. He was 48 years old when he made the discovery of his life. He would spend a decade from 1922 to 1932 recording the treasures and methodically clearing the tomb. Without his doggedness, Tutankhamun might never have been found. And without Tutankhamun, we probably wouldn't have a Grand Egyptian Museum.
This king was unique. And I think Howard Carter was so lucky to discover his tomb. And this is, in my opinion, is the most important discovery that's still in archaeology.
Howard Carter's archive is kept at an Egyptology centre, the Griffith Institute at Oxford University. His portrait has pride of place. A meticulous, demanding man, Egyptology will forever owe him an immense debt. On the light box, a visual record of his extraordinary achievement, one of the precious plate glass negatives taken by his photographer Harry Burton. This is the tomb's antechamber. On the left, a jumble of chariots and chariot wheels against a wall. To the right, some of the ritual couches. Some photos have been recently colorized. In this negative, you can just about make out Carter posing a little theatrically. Crowbar in hand, he eases out a rock as he breaks into the burial chamber. A select group of guests, including his backer Lord Carnarvon, were seated behind the camera watching history unfold. For his time, Carter's clearance of the tomb was exemplary. Artifacts like this guardian statue were sprayed with protective paraffin wax. But now, almost a century later, the wax has been taken off. This, a ceremonial chariot, every little bit of wax winkled and teased out, and the old sheen restored. Tutankhamun's outer coffin has been fumigated for insects. Just conserving this single artifact has taken some 8 months. This is the first time the coffin has ever left the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, some 300 miles to the south near Luxor, and it won't be going back there.
To be honest, most of the people on the West Bank were angry because of this. But when we took it out of the tomb, and the people have seen how the bad condition of the coffin was, so the people started to encourage us to get it back to how it looked like before.
The local residents did win one campaign. They're going to keep the mummy. Like the outer coffin, the authorities had wanted it for the new museum.
The people in Luxor think that their grandfather should stay there. And I really do respect this. When we decided to move it a few months ago, all the people in Luxor disagree with that. And this really actually made me happy. The mummy will stay there.
15 years ago, Zahi Hawass did manage to borrow the mummy for a CT scan, but only for the day.
When I went to scan the mummy, and I took the mummy out of the coffin, I looked at his face. That is the most beautiful moment in my life. The discovery, November 4th, 1922, 5,398 objects were found excavated by Carter for 10 years, the curse, Lord Carnarvon died. All of that made the magic of King Tut.
Everything, it seems, always comes back irresistibly to Tutankhamun. A century ago, only a few Egyptologists even knew his name. Now, everybody does. Central Cairo, and one of its most distinct landmarks, an unmissable edifice of salmon pink sandstone. The Egyptian Museum of Antiquities, so beloved by Egyptologists, opened in 1902, hall after hall of statuary and an ever-expanding collection. And here's where you can meet some of the relatives: the long-faced Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father, his stepmother, the beautiful Nefertiti, and his great-grandparents, Yuya and Tuya, once a power couple at court. You can also find other superlative gold funerary masks. These are from Tanis, a complex of royal tombs in the Nile Delta. They'll move into the Tutankhamun galleries once his treasures are moved out.
You know, Cairo Museum, you cannot close it, even if you have the Grand Museum. Still, if you enter this museum, you smell the history, you smell the past, and this is why we are keeping it as it is.
Of course, tourists always swiftly take the stairs to the second floor of the Cairo Museum. This is where, for the time being, you can still find the death mask and the rest of Tutankhamun's treasures. The display here has always seemed a little dull. Beautiful but old-fashioned glass cases and drab lighting. But then gold is still pretty stunning in any light. This is solid 22-carat gold, Tutankhamun's innermost coffin. Just over 6 foot long and a hefty 240 pounds, about the same weight as Anthony Joshua, the heavyweight boxing champion. More endearing, perhaps, a painted wooden sculpture of Tutankhamun, probably executed when he was in his early teens. This may have been a mannequin for his clothes. Back in the labs, they have, in fact, been carrying out the first ever scientific study of those clothes. This, believe it or not, is a scarf or shawl several meters long. Remember, like everything else, it's more than 3,300 years old. The research is part of a joint Egyptian-Japanese project.
Among the many objects from the Tutankhamun's tomb, textiles are the most deteriorated materials. Therefore, it was a request from the Egyptian government to work especially on the textiles from the beginning.
The triangle on the table is one of Tutankhamun's linen loincloths. Over 100 examples were recovered from the tomb and were evidently used in life.
I think there is no other project in the world which could compete to conserving Tutankhamun textiles. They're very, very important. They are fantastic materials.
This has been identified as a tunic of some kind. You can still clearly make out the design of a lotus flower, for ancient Egyptians, the symbol of eternal life. Japanese experts have also been advising on the big move from the Cairo Museum to the Conservation Lab. 2 years ago, pre-conservation, a ritual couch was bandaged up like a patient with sunburn. Traditional Japanese washi, or tissue paper, applied to fragile areas of gold leaf. A hunting chariot needed a bespoke crate and a lot of manhandling, almost enough men for a football team. The journey to the conservation centre is about 10 miles, the lorry wrapped in a Japanese flag. Tutankhamun's 6 chariots, they've discovered, were all made from a hardwood, elm, a tree not native to Egypt. The wood probably came from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, over 500 miles away. These gold leaf rods were a bit of a puzzle. We now know they're part of a sunshade for a ceremonial chariot, the oldest sunshade ever found. And this was another discovery. A dagger found with the mummy was made with iron from a meteorite. Anything that fell from the heavens seems to have had special meaning for ancient Egyptians. Back in the 1920s, most of Khartou's labourers were Egyptian men and boys. They cleared the scree right down to the bedrock. They carried the boxed up treasures to the Nile for the boat journey up to the Cairo Museum. Among these treasures, a fabulous pendant covered with scarab beetles, for ancient Egyptians a symbol of the sun and rebirth. For some reason, a boy who supplied water to the workers was photographed wearing it. This, so the story goes, is the child who actually found the tomb. Clearing a space for his large water jar, he chanced on the first step, the first of a flight of 16 down to the tomb. We expect his story to feature in the Grand Egyptian Museum. On site, we weren't allowed up the stairs to see the Tutankhamun exhibition space, but we do know that it's up there and off somewhere to the right, and that it'll be massive, 7,000 square meters. The Egyptians expect 2 to 3 million visitors in the first year, and they're hoping for up to 7 or 8 million in the longer term, and that would make the new museum among the top 3 most visited in the world. The Egyptians will soon have twin attractions on the Giza Plateau, the pyramids and Tutankhamun. In death, the Golden Boy became a god. That's what ancient Egyptians believed. For them, gold was the flesh of the gods. And of course, it's that gold that dazzles us still, and will surely tempt some of us to visit the treasures of Tutankhamun in their new home.